This afternoon I am joined by Duncan Campbell here from Glasgow, showing his film It for Others, which was last night, accompanied by Chris Marker and Alain René's Statues Also Die, which was like amazing. So if you missed it, you missed some serious, amazing cinematic moments happening last night. And Methieu, who is here from Metz in France with an exhibition at YYZ Gallery that will be on view until April 26th. So you did not miss that. There's some beautiful moments in that, not directly cinematic, although we'll get to that in a bit. I want to thank YYZ Gallery for hosting the exhibition with Methieu and the Consulate General of France, both for helping Methieu's project along and getting him over here from France, but also for securing the amazing film that we watched last night, which I won't rub in anymore for those of you who missed it.
35 millimeter print. Just say it. 35 millimeter print.
35 millimeter, Chris Marker, Alain René. Enough said. So I thought that I was really excited that the timing schedules of both Duncan and Methieu's itineraries here to Toronto lined up because both of their works that are in the festival are really quite fascinating and exciting for us in the way in which they're thinking about histories of cinema and engaging with those histories with questions about how those images are understood when they were made versus how they're understood today and what it means to revisit, recycle, reanimate, and ask other questions about their production and their circulation through to the present day. Because of that, I thought maybe the good starting point would actually be to ask both Duncan and Methieu to talk a little bit about their projects in the festival, specifically about the cinematic references and lineages in which they're working in. So with Duncan Campbell, that is the print of Statues Also Die that I won't talk about too much more. And with Methieu, it is the work of French filmmaker Sarah Maldoror, who's primarily known for a feature-length film called Sambizanga, yet Methieu's work is largely focused on another work of hers. So, gentlemen, who would like to maybe give a little bit of context and background?
Okay, well, I'm going to assume that not everybody has seen the film, so just bear with me. I'll just sort of give my own synopsis of Chris Marker and Alain René's film. It's about traditional art and kind of ceremonial objects from West Africa, and the film starts off as a sort of a ballad to these objects. There's a kind of a very interesting interplay between the musical score and the way they've filmed the object. As the film develops, it changes from that to discussion of that to the original purpose of these objects in the context of the society from which they were taken, and it develops into sort of anti-imperialist, anti-racist polemic at the end. I think that's really the thing that kind of got me about the film. I mean, it does have this very odd quality of time that, in terms of the issues that brings up, obviously there has been a whole, it was made in 1953, France is still colonial power, in power in the countries that the objects have come from, but some of the issues, so obviously that has changed, some of the issues haven't, so the issues about, which they bring up in the film, and I think that the kind of achievement of the film is that they managed to, it isn't just about that the independence struggle, but struggles that take place, but also about the cultural aspects about that, and about the issues of patrimony, and this, for me, the central argument, the pivot in the film is that they link the death of purpose of these objects with their commercialization and their consumption by colonial classes. So, just in response to what you said, Pablo, about like cinematic traditions, I think the thing that kind of engaged me, other than the issues and the kind of persistent relevance of the issues that the films bring up in terms of patrimony and repatriation, for example, in particular, but it does feel like a very contemporary film, and I think it is because of the way that the film is formally structured, the way there's a sort of a reverence that it opens out and then it kind of goes where the film takes it, so it changes. There's a number of times where it completely pivots, as far as from being quite lyrical at the beginning to it develops into this sort of polemic at the end. Will that do her?
Sure.
Yeah.
We'll come back.
Yeah.
Gotta give you a break.
Actually, that's really great that we started with the René and Marc films, because Présence Africaine was this publishing house in the 50s that commissioned the movie, and Sarah Maldoror was part of Présence Africaine with her husband Mario de Andrade, and they were kind of struggling. It was a kind of a cultural struggle, and so when I don't know, like you, like I don't know how many people have seen the show, but mostly it's about a film that this French director from the French West Indies did in the 70s, shot in the 70s in the Guinea-Bissau. And the thing is, like, she already made a movie called Monangambe that was commissioned by the Algerian government, who was like independent at the moment. And then they asked her to do a movie about the war in Guinea-Bissau. So she went there. She spent 3 months on one island, and she had planned to film the story of a peasant, a woman, and she wanted to film a political awakening, and but she did it in her own way. And when Sarah came back to Algeria, they saw the footage, and the Algerian government asked her to do a propaganda movie, and she didn't want to do a propaganda movie, so she was expelled from Algeria, and the reels disappeared. So to now, we don't know where are the reels where are the footage. And I started to do some interview with Sarah Maldoror in 2009, because at the beginning I wanted to see a film she made about Léon Gontran Damas, who was part of the Négritude movement, who was really close to Présence Africaine. It's a French Guyanese poet. I don't know if you know a little bit about the Négritude. It was composed about, it was Aimé Césaire, Léopold Sédar Senghor, and Léon Gontran Damas. It was really the core of the Négritude movement. And very few people actually nobody had made a film about Léon Gontran Damas, only Sarah. And as I'm from French Guiana, I really wanted to see it. And suddenly we started to discuss, and she told me the story of this Guns for Bantal, this movie that kind of was lost. And so we did a lot of interview together, and I found in her archive this photograph that were made by a set photographer. And I decided to take those photographs, which are some kind of document, archival documents, and to find a way to retell the story of the shooting, but also of Sarah Maldoror's journey in Guinea-Bissau, but also the political awakening of these militants. So you hear 3 voices in it's a slideshow. Maybe you will have the opportunity to see it. And I don't know if
Yeah.
good things.
No, that was good. I just wanted a little bit of context for the filmmaker Sarah Maldoror, who is probably less known as figures like Marco and René. However, I think Statues Also Die is maybe one of the lesser seen. It's maybe a film that's known about, but is not necessarily seen as much as some of the other more well-recognized films of those two major figures in French cinema. Duncan, I was thinking about. I mean, I mentioned last night this idea that this film kind of takes this departure from some of your earlier work, which some people in the audience may be familiar with either through images screenings or other ones, Bernadette, Make It New, John, and Arbeit, which are three films which use a sort of a biographical figure, a single sort of sole biographical subject as something to kind of explore an idea through. Like you use those figures as people to not simply tell their stories and not even necessarily tell a story about them, but you use their subjects and their contexts and their histories to kind of go somewhere else. And I was thinking about the trajectory of those three films leading up to this film, beginning with Bernadette, which is a film about the Irish activist and member of parliament Bernadette Devlin, and it's very focused on something that's close to you in terms of being about Irish politics and the troubles with England. Moving to Make It New, John, which is a film about the man who created the DeLorean and about the factories that DeLorean set up in Ireland. So it's moving outwards, but still kind of coming back to Ireland, to Arbeit, which is a film more generally about European economic financial troubles through the tale of Hans Tiedemeyer. So it's radiating further outwards, yet still kind of reflecting back on Ireland. To this film, which I feel like is then like really far outside of Ireland, yet still closes with sort of a discussion about image, history, production of images, production of history through images as they relate to Ireland. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, about your relationship to the subject within this film as you draw it back to Ireland.
I mean, I think it has been something that's been kind of that I've been trying to do. Like, so for example, with Arbeit, I mean, actually what I set out to do with that film was to make a film about money in a kind of an abstract sense, but quickly came up against my sort of very limited knowledge of technical economics. So I started looking at specific types of money, currencies, and I started reading a lot about the Deutschmark and like post-Second World War German economic development. And Hans Tiedemeyer just kept popping up, like he's kind of present at every sort of significant stage, and like from the kind of workshop wonder, which is this sort of like tiger economy growth that Germany had after the Second World War, to sort of stagnation in the 70s and the kind of shift from left to right, the German economic reunification, so the reunification of the currency, he oversaw that, and then he was the president of the Bundesbank in the transition to the euro, and was really instrumental actually in he's sort of the architecture of the European Central Bank. But so all of these questions of value and of what constitutes value, because at least in the European context, the European Central Bank is crucial in terms of the financial crisis in 2008. So in terms of getting at like questions of value and sort of fictitious value, which developed economies are so reliant upon in terms of their like financial services. So there was something between that and then like seeing statues also die, because it is like it's a strand of like as Methieu was saying with the Presence Africaine, it is a real strand in that magazine, as well as Negritude. There is a kind of overlapping, intertwined strand of Marxism, and that like that Marxist analysis, the way they link the death of the objects that they're talking about in the film with their commercialization, with the commodification, is a very kind of Marxist argument. I mean, I have to say also, like on a personal basis as a filmmaker, it's something I've been trying to do to kind of move away, because I think there is there's kind of limitations in terms of building everything around like a person, an individual, and that being your kind of narrative arc. So this is and actually part of the reason why in Arbeit why I wanted to make a film about money in the abstract sense was to kind of de-anecdotalize in that way, and I think that was like really one of another element in the appeal of Statues Also Die is that it's a history, but through objects. But I mean, so having established that as the premise of the film, I mean, people all come back in, always inevitably come back in, because first of all, in relation to the traditional African art, there is like a huge prevalence of like the sort of anthropomorphic object, and then in the section of film that deals with commodities, sort of contemporary commodities. That's I read a lot about. First of all, because I was looking at the commodities that were packaged, so they had eyes or they looked like very definitely like a body. But when you get into this, it's actually that's kind of based on a certain notion of a human body, and it's sort of designed to appeal to certain, it sort of conveys certain characteristics. So it is really sort of imbued, and also the idea about object having a sort of biography as well. So it's very difficult to avoid, but I've probably gone off on a little bit of a tangent in terms of what you asked me. But yeah, I mean, I think basically the premise of the film was that it was going to be like a history that was extrapolated from objects and that could extrapolate different notions of value. And I mean, the structure of the film, I mean, again, for people who haven't seen it, the film that I've made it for others, the beginning, the first 15 minutes of the film is a kind of response to Statues Also Die, to Marker and Renee's film, and it sort of reprises some of the themes. The only update which was sort of tracked through Présence Africaine is to do with the issues of patrimony, and the fact that all of the objects that appear in the film are still housed in the same museums in the West, and the sort of disingenuous position that they maintain in relation to holding on to, which is basically they're looted objects. So the first 15 minutes, it's followed on by a performance section, a film performance with the choreographer Michael Clark, which is to do with more kind of abstract notions of political economy and sort of development and money. And then on towards the end, discussion about the film itself as an object or as a commodity, and about its kind of condition as such. So it's sort of segmented. That comes from Statues Also Die as what I kind of understand to be the way that the film sort of changes and pivots. It's sort of extrapolated from that. But at the centre of it are objects and the kind of how we understand value through objects.
I mean, your film frames like the notion of, you're always kind of referring to the notion of objects, but I think that the inclusion of the IRA member in that photograph really kind of highlights the notion not simply of objects, but of images as objects. I mean, that kind of comes through your film, the sort of questioning of like, has Statues Also Die become one of these objects? What will become of this film that I'm making? What will become of these images of these Chinese factory workers? And I think that kind of ties into the questions that are really central to your exploration of Maldero's work, is this question of what is the value or the life of images that are connected to political moments, like this figure of the IRA soldier with the rifle, or the production of anti-colonial films in the service of, but also in the middle of the anti-colonial struggles that haven't necessarily completed. And so this tension about the Algerian government confiscating, destroying, kind of nixing this film because they saw a certain use value of those images to serve as a certain type of propaganda versus Maldora's vision for the images, which was also in a political realm and in a realm because she's working with members of the resistance in Guinea-Bissau, yet her approach to that is informed by something different because she studied cinema in the Soviet Union. She was an assistant director on Battle of Algiers. She was a friend of Chris Marker's. So I don't know. Maybe that could be something for you to kind of dive in with here as well.
Yeah, actually, that's one of the things that she doesn't remember that much precisely the shooting of on this movie, and what I was when I was searching, because I did some research in Lisbon, because there is this big foundation called the Foundation Mario Soares. Mario Soares was resistance, and he was really anti Salazar, and he was really fighting against the colonial politics of Portugal. And so there is this amazing archives in Lisbon, and I found these articles that are published in the leaflet, and that one of this article
the Lipinska writings?
Yeah. And in one of these articles, Susan Lipinska, who was a photographer, she's kind of explaining how was the shooting actually, and she explained that the people, they didn't wanted to be involved in this shooting because they didn't want it to be involved in the revolutionary process neither. And at some point, the filmmaker is arriving in a place and is telling to the people, okay, one, you have to fight, and two, you have to fight and make a movie. And that's, this kind of very ambiguous thing with militant cinema. It's at some point, what are the means you want to use to have this picture, and it wasn't even for the people in Guinea-Bissau, this film. It was for the people in Europe, because the problem at this moment in the 70s is like it was on the screen. You'll see only the Vietnam War and the African War were completely forgotten, or not forgotten, but at least invisible. So yeah, for me it's like, okay, we are dealing with this curious thing that you are using the technique of your enemy in a way to have a picture. I don't know. It's like, there is this big thing with. There was this big thing in Germany with the use of the images of the corpses in the Vietnam War by the anti-racist and anti-war movements, because they were kind of spreading the same picture that the colonizer were using to establish the supremacy. Mm-hmm. So it's like, what are these kind of pictures? That's really something that I'm trying to deal with, yeah. But I don't know if it answers.
No, yeah, for sure.
Sorry.
People are welcome to jump in at any time. I could go all afternoon, so don't be shy. I want to kind of get to something as you're talking about when you were doing the research in Portugal that kind of led to some of this stuff. There's another work of Methieu's which came out of some research in Portugal called Ça va en continue, which is a film, the one segment of which I'll kind of bring up to get to a question for both of these guys. You were working with, and this came out of the same archival research, or this was a different
Yeah,
research
actually,
trip.
yeah. It was the same research trip. Yeah.
The film works with an actress who was in a very well-known film called Montenegro.
Montenegro. Yeah.
Montenegro, and it collects a bunch of both photographs as well as audio recordings about the Portuguese colonial period in Angola. And she's kind of reflecting on some of these images. And there's a sequence in this film, so I'm getting to, in which there's a group of people kind of quizzing a figure on a stage, not unlike the place that we're in today. And the figure you sort of understand to be a stand-in for Methieu, who is getting lobbied with these questions by Angolans who are living in Portugal, who are sort of asking the artist this question of like, you know, who are you to talk about these images or to investigate these histories, and what's your relationship to this history, and what's your agency in this, in circulating these images and asking these questions about these histories. And I think that that's something that's really both complex and maybe unanswerable and really quite difficult about the way in which both of you are approaching these cinematic histories. Is what is your position within this cinematic moment of anti-colonial film production? Sarah Maldoror was a French West Indian filmmaker, but she's still a European who's making films about the anti-colonial movement in Africa. And obviously Chris Marker and Alain René, French filmmakers who were sort of saying things that no one was saying at that time period, yet still were positions of outsiders in this question of colonialism. And so I think it's quite interesting what both of you do as other European filmmakers, looking back on these histories and questioning what they do and how we understand them and how we receive them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think like Statues Also Die is a very interesting film for me because of that. Because I think like the way the film starts, the first thing that they basically postulate about the objects is their essential enigma, that we can't know them, and that, you know, the sort of because the societies, the peasant societies that the objects have come from, being so comprehensively decimated. I mean, and that basically allows them to kind of look at all the things that have been projected onto them. So in a lot of ways, the film is about the gaze in different ways. So it's about their gaze, and then they you know, more generally speak about, you know, Western gaze and all the things that have been projected onto these objects. I mean, it is sort of problematic in its own right, because of course it's not true that like absolutely nothing is known about the objects. I mean, it's a far more complicated, nuanced situation than that. You know, and like for example, even in terms of some of the objects that they show in the film, like the objects from Benin and Ife, and there's a connection, there's a sort of a chronology between the two, and techniques that came from Ife were then developed in like lost wax techniques and developed in Benin. So it's not strictly true, but it is a sort of, I mean, for me anyway, it's a kind of an allowable reduction, because it gets them past the point of being able to kind of look at something that's, I think it's incredibly difficult to get at, you know, as a filmmaker, to look at sort of issues of epistemic violence, you know, and that's really the achievement for me of the film, is that it managed to look at that, and ultimately, you know, what they're talking about is like what's at stake really is universal culture, and what constitutes universal culture, and whether universal culture is just this triumph of like sort of Western intellectual norms, or is it a situation where like kind of indigenous forms of African thought can kind of be considered on an equal basis, like rather than this sort of process of recognition by assimilation by recognition. Anyway, but so yeah, I mean, because I agree with what you were saying, Methieu, about that this sort of kind of polemic filmmaking, and this sort of tendency towards the left to kind of essentially make propaganda.
Yeah, actually, it was this kind of strategy. I don't know if you know these two filmmakers, Walter Hanowski and Gerhard Schumann. It was two German directors, and they kind of did many films about the Vietnam War and many films about the Congolese independence. And what they did was they for example, they did this movie that you can look on YouTube called titled The Laughing Man. And when they asked this guy called Müller, who was a former Nazi, and then went into the Democratic Republic, and then went to fight in Congo, and they just had this like simple framing when you see this guy talking, smiling, and telling, oh, he kind of killed, all the people in Congo, and they were from the East Bloc, and it was this kind of strategy, very extreme cinema, that you have to put the viewer, in front of something very aggressive, like abrasive. I don't know, and so, and for me, it's like a little bit the same thing with Maldoror when she say, okay, I'm not giving you the rice if you are not playing in the movie. And we have the food, and you need food. So that's something that was one of the methods. So yeah, but it just made me think of something about this story of Constantin Brancusi. The sculpture, and he had this kind of amazing collection of African art. And one day on the shelf, and one day he picked one of small statue and he started to sand it, like with sandpaper. And so he purified the statue, and suddenly it became this very famous statue called the White Negress, which is a polished mirror bronze statue. And it's like, the way they were using it, like the surrealist, and because that's this kind of violence that we can think of as well.
It's funny that you bring him up, because there was a discussion last night about the chairs and the Michael Clark thing, which I read as these very Brancusi-esque infinite tower objects, kind of broken up into pieces, relating back to that question of modernism and its relationship to these African sculptures.
I have a question for Duncan. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about your process around race and representation, and why you came to doing this remake of Statues Also Die in the first place. Well, first of all, how you came to your project, riffing off of the Marco Lenin film, but then also just sort of how you position yourself in that, I guess, post-colonial discussion of race and representation, and where you see your work fitting into that kind of spectrum of the politics around that.
I mean, I think obviously there is that element to the film. I think there's also, I think the thing that, like, underlying it all is the kind of the issues of value that I was talking about. So take the film, because the section of the film that deals with, or kind of reprises some of the themes in Statues Also Die is, like, about a quarter of the film in total. And so I think in terms of, like, position myself in terms of that debate, I don't think I've really kind of added anything to what because I think a lot of what they say in Statues Also Die kind of remains extant. I think that the only sort of update to that, and this really comes through the through Présence Africaine and kind of reading how the issues and that, because the film ends sort of optimistically. It ends with this kind of tantalising promise that there could be some sort of equality between Western culture and indigenous African culture. And so I think the only thing that I've added to that is just the way that these things have mutated from a kind of a directly colonial situation to kind of post or neo-colonial situation in relation to issues specifically to do with the objects and where they're housed, and the kind of patrimony issues of patrimony in relation to the objects, and which really kind of goes to the heart of the sort of right to use them or kind of represent them, and as well as physically kind of housing and kind of claiming ownership over the objects. I think the extension of that with museums is that they're also claiming the right to be the only ones to be able to represent them. Is that I mean, are you talking about like in terms of like post-colonial theory?
Well, I mean, I was kind of wondering why you started with the marker film to start with, where the project was where the seed of that came from. I didn't see. I saw you presented in Rotterdam, but I didn't see it last night. So maybe you said that in the introduction, like how it came about. So I'm kind of curious about that, but you know, I mean, I guess I'll just throw it out there, like, I don't know, I think that it is an interesting topic in the discourse around ownership, and particularly in the Western institution that houses these objects, and where that fits on the political spectrum of, but I'm also curious, you know, as a white guy coming from the United Kingdom and
Ireland.
going back to my bad. But you're living in Scotland.
Yeah.
Right? But just, you know, like really where that came from. And I mean, I see like there's parallels that Pablo's already talked about.
Well, let me ask you, do you think that the fact that I'm a white Irish guy, does that exclude me from
I don't think it excludes you, but I think it definitely should be. I mean, it is part of the discourse and part of the sort of spectrum of representation, and whose voice is in the auditorium. I do think, for me anyway, it factors into the politics of representation, absolutely. And so that I'm not suggesting you should be excluded from anything. I'm just asking you I'm curious about where you position yourself on that spectrum.
I mean, I think there's part of, even in the first part of the section of my film that deals with these objects, which like explicitly and specifically deals with these with the issues that you're talking about, because I think they are very complicated, and speaks about, you know, what right do I have to speak about in relation to the director of British Museum. There's a radio program that he makes. So and you know, it's not something that I'm kind of I can sort of give you a definitive, comprehensive, like this is what I feel my position is in it, because I think part of the like, I mean, this is true with all my films, that part of the process is me finding out about these things, and to try and kind of be sort of definitive, like to arrive at like a sort of terminal position in relation to that. I think it's something that's constantly evolving, and if I was to make another film about it, it would change again. It's something that I admire greatly about Chris Marker, actually. So if you look at, like, for example, statues also die, where that film ends, the sort of optimistic prospect that the film ends with. And in Sans Soleil, when he returns to Guinea-Bissau, it's a lot more kind of there's a lot more cynicism actually about what's happened post-independence there. But I think the thing that I admire about that is that it's still open-ended. Like he sort of resists the temptation to kind of conclude about that, and so it kind of leaves it open-ended. I've tried to do that. Whether or not that's successful is it's up to you.
I mean, I would bounce this over to Methieu to talk about with your own work, but also then to kind of maybe frame within what Sarah Maldoror was doing as a filmmaker, because she's like there's I feel like I've read interviews where she sort of talks about this odd position of how do you define what an African filmmaker is, and her position is not necessarily being an African, but someone who works in Africa and has relationships there, and is from the French West Indies, which are colonized by African slave trade many centuries ago. And so her position as an insider or an outsider to the subjects that she was working with is something that I think is quite fascinating and complex. And then to kind of extend that to what you do, which I think is looking at her production of those images and the circulation of them and their life and their existence, but also I think puts your own position of questioning your relationship to the material as an insider or an outsider, or where you exist within the reproduction or the retelling or the recirculating of that archival material.
I might say that the main goal at the beginning was to find a way to put some work back in their right place, the place they belong, which is a cinema world. So that's the reason I started also the project with Sarah, to work with her. It's just okay at one point, there's a director who seems to have difficulty to screen, for example, to know where all the things are, and so find a way to help it. And but just it's because I'm sorry, I'm stuck in the other questions, because I'm not sure that I really understand the relationship with the voice, and because for me there's a continuity. We have the tendency to think that colonialism was just a side effect of capitalism, and it was the center of the capitalist politics. And so this idea to think that there's a Western world, and it's just a continuum, and the way Britain, for example, industrialization kind of was like it was. It's because of colonialism, and it's not like. And so I think it's the same thing when you are when you are taking this kind of object like the statue Methieu, which is for me like it was made for the Western world, and I don't, and it speaks of capitalism. It's a discussion about capitalism. That's the way I see it, and I think that's the greatness of this movie. It's like building this kind of continuum. But sorry, it's just
no.
Since and I don't remember the other. Well.
Where to go? May not be necessary. I mean, this question about someone who, like, looking at something that's outside of one's own history and what that means, because I think to maybe kind of go back to your answer to the other question, that it is a continuum, and that I think that these notions of agency or ownership about creating images or circulating images or trying to describe some sort of narrative of history, that notion of someone who is within it or is outside of it is not something that's so easily defined. And so I was bringing up Maldoror as an example that maybe you could talk more about, but also use that to say something about your own position in relationship to her films, but also and you have a whole bunch of other works which are about largely Lusophone African colonies and the anti-colonial struggles that were happening in those countries.
Actually, I'm more dealing with the biography of objects now. But yeah, I think also we can, like you said about the René's film, you can say also that there's a violence to use the images of the shooting or even the films of Salvador and to try to reframe them and to reuse them. And so that's the reason why I came with this project, Ça va, ça va, on continue, because I had a lot of problem with the slideshow that you can see at YYZ, because it was always the questions. Okay, you are a white male using 3 female voices, which are only white actresses playing black characters, but for me it's like, okay, of course we have to deal with that, but and the way to deal with it is to try to produce a kind of awareness for the audience. Like the audience, I'm trying to say to the audience, okay, what are you looking at? For example, you will see in the slideshow like a woman covering her breasts, and at some point you have black women filling meal with their naked breast, and it's okay. It was shot in the context of a militant movie, but still it reminds all the images of colonial pornography that were produced in the during the century. And so every time I have this kind of picture, I'm trying to say to the viewer, okay, what are you looking at? What is your gaze actually? What is your way of understanding these pictures? And that's and it's not too. I don't want to be moralistic, because that's I think it's like shutting everything. Like, okay, don't look at that. But it's just, okay, I'm putting you in front of this picture. What is that?
Yeah.
An answer?
Yeah. Other folks?
Do you think that a film is a medium that can, I mean obviously I guess you do, but just if you would like to comment on this avoidance of kind of dualisms that often get raised in this question of representation and the politics of that film especially since the 60s, Chris Marker, whoever, is a medium through its form somehow that can provide those multiplicities of narratives that then open the discourse with. The politics of film itself is such a strangely charged medium for these questions because of its relationship to documentary, because of its dominance by men, for one thing, and the costs that traditionally are involved with making film.
It's for you as well.
Yeah. Can you say it one more time? The question. Sorry.
It wasn't very
Yeah. So, but it's to do with like documentary traditions in relation to politics.
I guess I was thinking about film as a medium that has a very strong narrative structure. At Methieu, you created an installation that I think plays really well a lot of these questions because of the sort of space that it develops and the audience's involvement in it, and film being in this darkened space, which creates a narrative that you follow. With a very, ultimately, you have to accept that there's a strong voice of an author. You know? Maybe that is a question at least.
Sounds like more one for you.
Yeah, okay. So, this one is fun. No, I don't know if I'm going to. But for me, film is every time I think of Birth of a Nation, you know, this David Griffiths movie, and which is the more racist movie you can imagine, but at the same time, it's a masterpiece. In terms of editing, it's really a revolutionary film, and but it's like it produced something that's still is everywhere in I don't know, the American cinema. You know, this kind of structural thing that we have to deal with. You know, this kind of insidious racism, and so there is, for me, this is an idea of cinema. And there is this other one, which is third cinema, and I feel really close to this kind of politics, and you know, which oblige the viewer to be, and the producer as well, to be every time changing sides and changing position and reinvent himself. And to kind of show the structural strings, I don't know, that are like wrapping the movie together, I don't know, something like that. I don't know if I answer, I'm sorry.
Other folks? Merlu?
I'd like to ask the question of engagement, because I know Marker and the next film better, but from what I get in the film that you've been looking at that cannot be found, there is a strong sense of engagement in the both filmmakers that you've been following in the work that they were doing at the time they were doing it. And I'm wondering, how do you, in your own work, when you work with these, on the basis of these subjects, how do you deal with the question of engagement?
You mean engagement with the issues that they're...
With the issue that you're interested in looking at through your work.
Mm-hmm.
So your own engagement as an artist,
I mean, I think they are kind of issues to do with like engagement with issues with representation, you know, because I think like that's in that film, like you are dealing with kind of representations or sort of historically, but also the way Marker and Renee kind of implicate themselves in the process, and so they're sort of issues to do with kind of representation and how that sort of like sort of the epistemic issues are behind that, about like the you know, about like sort of someone from the West, or you know, that kind of idea of a Western gaze like on these objects, but and kind of bringing that out into the open, I guess, you know, is sort of the achievement of the film. I mean, in terms of the film that I've made, I mean, I think like that's actually just going back to what your question as well, because I think the sort of forms that you have at your disposal are very kind of imbued with like all sorts of subjectivities, and so dealing with things that are more kind of systematic or kind of epistemic, I think it is a very difficult task. It's almost kind of impossible. I mean, one of the things that I looked at was, and it is made reference in the film that I made, is a set of notes that Sergei Eisenstein had made. He'd made a series of notes. He was preparing a film of Marx's Capital, and he wanted to film it. And it's really interesting because just how kind of tortured he became about the impossibility of doing something like that, you know. about, you know, the further you move away from like a specific kind of historic situation, or, you know, even kind of building sort of narrative arc around a person, the more difficult it becomes, and like how sort of formally fragmented that is. And I mean, I guess that's something that is, because you know, ultimately I think they're, and it doesn't just go for it for others, but the like most of the films that I've made are sort of failures in a way. They kind of unravel, because I do think it's like, if you go back to an early, like some of the earlier films, like the Pablo mentioned in the introduction, of the film about Bernadette Devlin, or McAlliskey as she is now. I mean, the idea that you could kind of encapsulate even a period of her life, or her politics, in a 37-minute film is sort of ridiculous. But I do think it's part of, I do feel like a sort of, you know, kind of compelled to make that explicit in the work as well. Over to you.
Do you have anything to say about that?
Engagement, yeah. I think there's this kind of huge gap between what we are doing and what they were doing, and it goes with this kind of enthusiasm. And you know, that this thing with this picture is like, we are, for example, the picture of the war of the liberation war, African liberation war, is like, now when we see them, it's like we are seeing also warning. We are seeing the warning not to be close to this kind of picture, not to be too close to this kind of struggle, not to be, because we grew up with this failure, this big failure of all these projects. And so if there is an engagement, is to try to bypass this warning and to go back to the enthusiasm, and to find a way to not to be too cautious with them, to try to connect with this this moment that
I think it's an interesting point, that idea of being cautious and having also this experience, this historical experience. And most recently, I think in 2010, 2011, with what happened during the Arab Spring, there was also a lot of enthusiasm amongst like artists and intellectuals who were writing about it, talking about it, and then came a certain disenchantment with some of the results of what happened there. Maybe some people here could talk better about this than I do, but I think there is also, we have a recent experience.
yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I just like, as a little kind of addendum to, like, even like Chris Marker's relationship to Statues Also Die changed. Like, at a certain point, he sort of disavowed pretty much everything that he'd made, including Statues Also Die. So everything that he'd made before he made Legete, sort of disavowed. And it is actually for reasons that Methieu was talking about the probably kind of felt like that there was a sort of an over exuberance and over enthusiasm for, not just with this film, but you know, with the kind of politics that he was engaged in.
I've been thinking a lot about this question of militant cinema, and to like think of, obviously we've kind of talked about this before with Sarah Maldora's work, but other filmmakers of this time period like René Vautier, or even if we are to consider Statues Also Die within the history or trajectory of militant cinema to some degree. I mean, one thing that I wonder about, either of you commenting on would be through your looking at these works, do you feel that the potency of either of these films or filmmakers and their gestures towards some sort of like radical anti-colonial position or militant position is something that changes, transforms, lessens, or increases through time?
There is a formal invention. Actually, I don't. For the Cuban cinema, it's really obvious. That's what stays is like what stays is the kind of invention, energy, like all they produced, and it was produced in a to kind of create this explosion, and so. The Hour of Furnaces, for example, by Solanas and Getinos, it's still an amazing movie, because you have all this kind of amazing editing, Fanonian discourse, all this kind of thing that still now is really relevant. But I think it's the same with Statue Also Die. You know, you have formally this invention that struck you, like all this, you know, when the masks are put on this background, this Molinagi style background, it's like amazing. It's.
But yeah, but it's also the way the film pivots as well. I think that it is a sort of, for me, it's kind of like, seems like a prototype for Sans Soleil. You know, the way that sort of changes, and you have all these kind of streams of like kind of overlapping information, and you kind of you're following one. You know, it sort of opens out and then kind of goes somewhere else, and there is something really kind of radical. I mean, especially for the time that it was made about that. But I think it is like kind of at the bottom, at least for me anyway. Why it sort of still kind of has that potency is. Yeah, for what you're saying, it's sort they're kind of formal reasons.
No, but I'm just thinking that there is this movie of Ahmed Rashedi, L'Aube des Damnés, The Dawn of the Damned, and he's kind of very close to the Marker and René's movie, but he doesn't have this kind of like switch, and suddenly it's not that interesting because formally it's not, you don't have this kind of experimental side of Statues Also Die. But that can be engagement, you know, this formal, this kind of radicality in editing, in sorry.
I would agree. I just kind of wanted something else to say. I mean, no, because it's like Monon Gombe, which you might be able to watch part of it on YouTube somewhere, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
probably from when you showed it in an exhibition. Is what the first film of Sarah Maldoror, and it's amazing. I mean, it's like amazing. It's brilliant, and its potency is not at all lessened by its time through history, or even the specifics of its context and the particular narrative which she's trying to tell. And that's because of the way in which she structured this film, the way in which she worked with the Art Ensemble of Chicago to provide the soundtrack. It's such a incredible film. The same very much is true for the Marker and René film. I feel like it's just, particularly if you see the 35mm print, you watch last night.
With subtitles.
A little bit of it comes through on YouTube version that's out there. So. Kate, were you going to chime in?
I was just curious because I was thinking about militant cinema and the life of militant cinema and how it survives, and then I was thinking of the objects, the masks, and the objects that Marker's talking about, and they are talking about the statues. And if statues die when they become art, does cinema die when it becomes art too?
Whoa.
festival's over, guys. Just cancel the rest of it. It's become irrelevant.
Or, I mean, or just militant cinema or engaged cinema, or does that kind of engagement, can it survive being put into this different a different context? So when you take marker into a gallery, or take ceremony or into a gallery, does it bring it back to life in a way? It creates a new dynamic for which to engage in it, or does it also have the risk of closing it off in that last case?
I mean, I suppose it remains to be seen, you know, like, who knows the consequences of, you know, I mean, you can probably forget about my intentions or Methieu's intentions, but the sort of what happens with that is, it does kind of remain to be seen. I mean, hopefully not. Hopefully it doesn't mean that it's. But you know, I mean, nor this idea of kind of radical cinema. I mean, I kind of grew up with political culture, with like, for example, murals, like political murals, and the purpose or the effect that they had at the time. It did the sort of galvanizing effect was very important at a certain period of time. It's sort of become redundant. The flip side of that is that they do also kind of serve to reinforce a certain sense of community as well. So there's a kind of a double-edged thing. But I don't really have anything against that, against sort of contingency and against, you know, things don't necessarily have to endure like that.
Don't have anything.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, oh, yeah.
I think actually it's a very interesting point. And for me, it's related to the notion of traveling theory, that something was done at a certain point in time for a specific purpose that was militant and a very specific cause. And for example, Duncan, you mentioned that the statue note C ends in a positive note, and you don't read it as a definitive statement. That was his perspective at that point in time. When you then travel in time, in the future, who's going to see it, the context in which people are going to see it, what the concerns of that day, all that will completely transform the piece. So it doesn't, on the one hand, it dies as a militant piece, but on the other hand, it could still stay relevant in another way. It resonates somehow.
Hear, hear.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that's a good point to end the formal conversation. Yet we can continue to drink coffee and shelter ourselves from the rain and talk informally. Tomorrow, in a nice sort of continuation, we will reconvene here at 3 p.m. for the talks with Maha Mamoun, who's here from Cairo, and Narimana Mari, who's here from Algeria. Maha's video is on view at VTape, Night Visitor, the Night of Counting the Years, along with a suite of photographs, which is viewable not today, but again, starting tomorrow, gallery hours. Narimana Mari's film Lubia Hamra, Bloody Beans, is playing at Jackman Hall tonight at 9 o'clock. So Mary Lou, your sort of questions about the Arab Spring will be brought in context with the Algerian Revolution as we continue this conversation tomorrow. So please join us for that. Thanks.